We're going to hear a great deal in the next few days about the ideology underpinning President Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And that ideology is confusing. Why? Because I think he is fundamentally confused. At heart, he remains a communist. But about 25 years ago, he was converted to Christianity, to Orthodox Christianity, by a man called Archimandrite Tikhon Shevkunon. He is the abbot, or sometimes called the abbot, of the Sretensky monastery. Now, most high-ranking clerics in the Orthodox Church are monks. You can tell who they are because they're the ones who have a veil on their hat. But it's not only the ideology of a very extreme form of Russian Orthodoxy that he's embraced. He's also particularly keen on historical writings, and specifically the writings of Ivan Ilyerin. Ilyerin produced a book called Our Tasks, and Shevkunon produced a documentary in 2008 called The Lesson of Byzantium, and we need to put the two things together. But in the last couple of days, Putin has come out with the most extraordinary story, or the most extraordinary claims about the links between Christianity and communism. And he's talking about he's adding to the debate about what to do with the body of Lenin. And if you go to the Kremlin, which I've done, and you're taken on a tour, you go through all these incredibly boring rooms full of carriages and jewels, and you're taken very quickly through the churches because the tour guide is too versed in communism to really understand what all the icons mean. And anyway, Putin says, communist ideology, I'm quoting, communist ideology is very similar to Christianity. In fact, freedom, equality, brotherhood, and justice, all of that is laid out in scripture. And this is quite extraordinary. He says, he goes on, Lenin was placed inside a mausoleum. How is that different from holy relics? He acknowledges that someone may not like that comparison. But of course, what he's trying to do is to set up a new standard of ideology. So the West, of course, is the capitalist West, and this is being rejected. The alternative to capitalism is communism, and Putin is falling back onto his childhood beliefs. Now, I don't think Putin is necessarily an evil man. I think he's embraced evil. In fact, I would parallel the observation of George W. Bush, who said that he'd looked into Putin's soul, and what he saw was essentially a good man. But I think he's easily manipulated. He is given to being a showman, he's an autocrat, he's a bully, but he's also easily manipulated by people who he admires for being intelligent, because I think essentially Putin is not. Putin, you've got to remember, got his degree by paying somebody to write it. He paid somebody else to write his thesis. Now, a Russian Orthodox prelate, a person called Father Gleb Yakunin, who is not seen in a positive light by Patriarch Kyrill, says that under Kyrill, the Church has tried to whitewash the sins of the USSR, and it's become a hive of former collaborators. That's certainly my observation too. And the ideology behind the invasion of Ukraine is probably to be found in a documentary that was made on the eve of the seizure of the Crimea in 2013, called The Second Christianization of the Rus. And it it drives the idea that orthodoxy should be reclaimed under Moscow, and that Moscow should recapture the first center of Slavic Christianity under Prince Vladimir in Kiev. It might even imply that the Moscow Patriarch should recapture Constantinople, modern Istanbul. Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us, said Putin. It is the inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. That's what he said immediately upon the invasion of Ukraine this time. In Our Tasks, Illyrin's book, written while he was in exile in Berlin, under the influence of fascism, writes about a new dictator, a national dictator shall emerge, who will be the living organ of Russia. And his greatest advocate is Alexander Dugin, the person whose daughter was killed in a car bomb. And that is his significance, and that is probably why he or his daughter was targeted. He underpins the ideology of Putin and the war. And 10 days after the war began, Kyrill took up the same theme, that the war in Ukraine is a metaphysical struggle against the values of the West. And he summarizes the values of the West by saying you have to have a gay pride parade. But if you start comparing Christianity with communism, it doesn't work. Although there are themes in common, although the biblical Christianity evident in the life of Jesus in the Gospels is a set of values based on poverty and equality. Indeed, the word liberty occurs 16 times in the New Testament. But there is no cowed philosophy that sort of drives the masses to equality in terms of riches and poverty. Moses says in Exodus 23, verses 2 to 3, it's worth looking at that. You shall not follow a crowd and do evil. You're there to be independent and individual. Christianity is a religion of individuality. And I think that probably is more central than the nascent communism which might be seen in the story of Ananias and Sapphira, the beginning of Acts of the Apostles, where they promise money and then don't give it and are then punished. We have to be very careful about the implications in sort of biblical and papal writings like Pacem in Terris or in the Rise of Liberation theology, in exactly the same way as I think we have to be very careful about over-labeling or over-identifying the early 20th century papacy with fascism, as for example, the fascist leanings of Pius XII, Cardinal Pacelli. But there is no doubt, in a very glib way, Putin is right. There are links between communism and Christianity, insofar as a focus on riches is not necessarily going to be efficacious in one's spiritual journey. That's not quite what communism in practice advocates. I've seen the huge apartments that the communist elite would have lived in. They're now lived in by oligarchs. They cost a huge amount of money. If you can afford them, then you live closer to the Kremlin in these huge apartments. There's one of the great saints of Orthodoxy is St. John Chrysostom, and he indeed wrote the basic liturgy, which is celebrated every Sunday. And he says, it cannot be said that the rich exhale more air or consume more light. Everything really important is evenly distributed. It's already there. The equality and the liberty is already there. It's not something that we need to create, it's something we need to find. And that's the big difference, I think, between communism and Christianity. For Christianity, it's about looking and recognizing the equality that is there. For communism, it's about breaking down the inequality that we see and creating an equality that may not be already there. For communism, it's about a physical change, a physical reality. For Christianity, it's about a spiritual perception. There is a difference.